Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on church history. In this episode, we will transition from the 15th into the 16th century, laying the foundations for the study of the Protestant movement. So the first pope of the 16th century actually became pope in the 15th. The 213th pope, Innocent VIII, died on the 25th of July, 1492, after a reign of 7 years and 11 months. He was followed as Pope 214 by Pope Alexander VI, who reigned from 1492 to 1503, so becoming the first pope of the 16th century. The conclave of 1492, when Innocent VIII died, faced a new alignment of power in Western affairs. Only 8 months earlier, in January of 1492, the last Islamic base in the Iberian Peninsula fell. This was the Emirate of Granada. Recall in the patristics course or the medieval course, I forget what class I talked about what with, but it occurred in the year 711 AD when Islam invaded what is now Spain. And so this in 1492, 700 years later, was the last Islamic political entity. The victors were King Ferdinand II, the King of Aragon and Valencia, along with his wife, Queen Isabel I of Castile and Leon. Previously, Spain had not been united since the Roman Empire fell. It was a number of separate kingdoms that came into being as more and more territory was conquered from Islam, until the last Islamic base was Granada in the south. Then in January of 1492, Ferdinand and Isabel successfully conquered it. Since the two sovereigns were married, much of what we think of as Spain then became united under the House of Trastamara. That explains why the conclave, the papal conclave, elected a successor to Pope Innocent VIII, was willing to elect a Spanish cardinal instead of an Italian as the 214th pope. Born on January 1st, 1431, near Valencia, in the Kingdom of Aragon, he was baptized Rodrigo de Borgia, but it's best known by the Italian version, Borgia, Borgia. At the time, Rodrigo's maternal uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, was serving as Bishop of Valencia. On April 8, 1455, Uncle Alfonso was elected Pope Callistus III. Uncle Alfonso sent Rodrigo to study canon law at the University of Bologna in Italy, and after being elected Pope Callistus III, he appointed nephew Rodrigo a cardinal in February of 1456 at the age of 25, and named him vice-chancellor of the Holy See. So this is, standard feudalism procedure. In 1468, Cardinal Rodrigo was then ordained to the priesthood after being a cardinal since 1456. And in 1471, he was ordained bishop and appointed cardinal bishop of Albano. For the next 36 years, Cardinal Rodrigo divided his time between Rome and Spain, building a personal fortune, establishing a network of contacts of a political and mercantile nature. He served under 5 popes. He inherited and passed on from his uncle the endemic vices of feudalism, nepotism, in particular, as well as accumulation of benefices, even those with care of souls. And having gone to Italy for his education, he had fully internalized the Renaissance, the values of the Renaissance, both the positive and negative. On the positive side, he was exceptionally well educated, very cultured, patron of the arts, the visual arts, as well as literary arts, and then on the darker side, he the Renaissance was a revival of pre-Christian Greek and Roman literature, music, poetry, architecture, and also with it, naturally, came the morality, the pre-Christian morality of classical Greek and Rome, which was a pagan morality characterized by vice and carnal immorality. As witnessed in Pope Alexander's life, one of his mistresses was a Roman aristocrat named Venosa Catani, with whom he had 4 children. One of them, the famous Cesare Borgia. I'll do it. The eldest, Juan, he made Duke of Benevento, then arranged a marriage for Juan with a Spanish princess who brought an immense dowry. He appointed Cesare, a younger son, cardinal at the age of 19. Goffredo, the youngest son, he married off to the granddaughter of the King of Naples. And for his own daughter, Lucretia, he arranged a series of 3 lucrative marriages for Lucretia to very wealthy, very elderly men, nearing the conclusion of their earthly existence. So, of course, she would inherit resources. After becoming Pope, Rodrigo, after he became Pope Alexander VI, took a younger mistress from another powerful Italian house, Giulia Farnese. For her sake, he named her younger brother Alessandro a cardinal in 1493 at the age of 25. In 1534, that guy would become Pope Paul III, the man who summoned the Council of Trent, and arguably began the process of saving the church from the Protestant movement. Now, he didn't live to finish the council, but as we'll see, it was not a foregone conclusion. But he's the one that started it. In the year of the election, in the fall of 1492, a Genoese Italian mariner named Christopher Columbus was sailing west from Spain in command of 3 ships paid for by Queen Isabella of Castile, attempting to find a sea route to China and India that would allow trade to be conducted directly, and therefore bypassing the overland caravan route that followed the Silk Road. At 10 p.m., On the evening of October 11th, 1492, Columbus saw a light on a lookout saw it first, and then, but anyway, the expedition saw a light on the horizon, evidently produced by a bonfire on one of the islands of the Caribbean. But at that point, they could not make out land, as it was night. The next morning, at 2 a.m., on October 12th, 1492, a lookout sighted land and changed history. Columbus first touched land in the New World on the Bahamian island of Guanahani, which Columbus renamed the Holy Savior, the island of the Holy Savior, San Salvador. It is 280 miles north of Cuba, 400 miles west and south of Miami, Florida. The indigenous people he encountered called themselves the Taino, Taino. They were part of the Arawak language group, which was part of the larger Carib island civilization, for whom the Caribbean is named. So the New World was brought into the European sphere of influence, beginning with this discovery, and the Carib civilization would be virtually exterminated by European disease within 25 years. Columbus's second voyage, he made 4 to the New World. His second voyage lasted from September 25th, 1493, to June 11th, 1496, in the course of which he discovered the islands of Puerto Rico, Dominica, and Jamaica. He returned from his second voyage, and a monk who was on the voyage with him, Romano Pane, first wrote a description of the tobacco plant. Okay, Portugal. Portugal was, of course, also engaged in finding a sea route to India and China, because they also wanted to bypass having to pay the middlemen, the overland caravan route that followed the Silk Road from China to Constantinople. But their strategy, the Portuguese strategy, was sailing around Africa to get there. Of course, when they started, they had no idea how large Africa was, which is why Columbus, beat them. But they would eventually accomplish it. 5 years after Columbus's first voyage, when a Portuguese mariner named Vasco da Gama rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, on November 22nd, 1497, establishing that it was possible to sail from Lisbon, Portugal, to India. But rewinding back to 1492, Portugal, when Columbus, of course in 1492, Columbus himself thought, and would die believing, that he had reached the outskirts of China and India. He thought those islands were just off the coast of China, India, or Japan. And nobody else knew differently. So in 1492, Portugal, thought the same thing. And they did not know that they were going to eventually succeed in rounding the coast of Africa, as they kept going further and further south, and it was just incomprehensibly large. So there was always the possibility that there was no way around it. That it would just go on and on and on, and there would not be a sea route around it. So, in 1493, the monarchs of Spain and Portugal petitioned Pope Alexander VI to draw a line of demarcation on the map, which would establish the relative spheres of influence in what everyone still thought was Asia. The line was first drawn 300 miles west of the Azores Islands in the Atlantic. Those islands are 1,000 miles off the west coast of Portugal. So 1,000 miles there, then 300 miles further west, and that's where the line was drawn. The following year, on June 7th, 1492, the Treaty of Tordesillas and to Spanish speakers, I apologize if I've mispronounced it. So it's spelled Tordessillas. It altered, it adjusted the original treaty by moving the line 1,110 miles west of the Azores. So 1,000 miles to the Azores, then 1,110 miles further west of that, which, now they didn't know it at the time, and now this is a north-south. This is a longitudinal line, north-south, around the whole globe. So they didn't know it at the time, but that put Newfoundland and Brazil on the Portuguese side of the line, which is why in Brazil they still speak Portuguese instead of Spanish. On January 25th, 1494, the King of Naples in southern Italy died. His name was Ferdinand I, or Ferrante in Italian history. Ferrante was the illegitimate son of Alfonso V, King of Aragon, with one of his Italian mistresses. Through his father, though illegitimate, Ferrante was a member of the House of Trastamara, therefore a first cousin of King Ferdinand II of Aragon, as in the Ferdinand who was the husband of Isabel. Alfonso V had taken Naples and Sicily by conquest in 1442 from King René I of the French House of Anjou, making himself Alfonso I in Neapolitan history. He passed the crown of Naples to his illegitimate son Ferrante in 1458. When Ferrante died in 1494, his son, Ferrante's son, followed him as Alfonso II, King of Naples. But through the French House of Anjou, and you refer to your notes in the medieval course about that, how the French got involved in southern Italy. But from the French House of Anjou, the King of France had a claim on the throne of Naples and Sicily if they ever wanted to enforce it. And as it happened, the French king at the time did. This was Charles VIII. King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy in September of 1494 with 25,000 men. His stated goal was to enforce the French claim of the ousted House of Anjou to the crown of Naples and Sicily. King René I, who was ousted but alive, he died childless. So Charles VIII intended to take the throne of Naples for himself, for the House of Valois, which was the ruling dynasty of France, and related ultimately to the House of Anjou. Italy, for reasons that by now, after the late patristics course as well as the whole medieval course, reasons that by now should be very familiar, was not capable of presenting a coherent defense. Italy was not a united country at that point. So King Charles marched with little opposition through Italy. And when he did encounter it, his 25,000 men and their artillery swiftly overcame it. One such victory would have long-term consequences, which is why I'm talking about this now. Believe it or not, this is going to impact church history. I know you don't believe me, but be patient. Which brings us to the city of Florence in Tuscany. In Florence, Piero de' Medici. All right, that family, it's spelled D''Medici, but it's de' Medici. Piero de' Medici was the son of Lorenzo de' Medici, known in Italian history as Lorenzo the Magnificent, a great patron of the arts. Piero had taken over Florence after his father's death, and Lorenzo also died in 1492. It's one of those years. A lot of things happen. Piero decided when Charles invaded France, when the French invaded France, he decided that he would oppose, that Florence would oppose the French invasion. And if you remember from the late medieval course, we talked about the development of the condottieri, which were professional mercenaries. Condottieri is from the Italian word for contract. So these were, professional mercenaries. And no one had a standing army at this point. So it was just easier to hire these guys, and they had units, and they had under the command of their own condottiero, the captain. And that's what these city-states did. So the condottieri that Piero de' Medici hired to fight on behalf of Florence against the French invasion were badly defeated. And the Medici family was therefore forced to flee Florence in 1494. So they, otherwise, if they risked capture by the French, they could have just been killed. But given that they were rich, the French probably would have let them ransom themselves. But that would have impoverished the family. So easier just to run away. And they took refuge in Venice, which was a merchant republic, and the Medici were a banking family, so that they had friends there. In the power vacuum, as this is now 3 generations that the Medici family had been running the city of Florence, so there's a vacuum. In that power vacuum, a violent reaction occurred. In order to understand it, keep in mind the pendulum effect. There appears to be no escape from the pendulum effect in human history. That I guess it's part of human nature that would, one extreme to the other extreme. And extremes produce each other. So remember, when we talked about the Renaissance, Florence, the grandfather, the great-grandfather of Piero de' Medici was Cosimo de' Medici, who was the first. He didn't found the family bank. He inherited it. But the family, that the family made their money in textiles, dyeing cloth. Then Cosimo's father started the bank. And with that, Cosimo essentially took over, de facto took over. He was not a king or anything, but he de facto took over control of the city of Florence. And with his wealth was a great patron of the arts, and funded many of the scholars rediscovering ancient Greek and Latin manuscripts. And he funded artist workshops, libraries, for people to redevelop those techniques of painting and sculpture and architecture and all the arts, music, everything. So Florence became known as a center for the Renaissance, for this rebirth, this revival of Greco-Roman classical learning. The problem being, one of the problems being, is that the time of history they idealized was the time before Christ, the Greek and Roman classics. And in reading the Greek and Roman classics, some more than others, but in all of them, you generally find, not all of them, I should say, but in an overwhelming percentage of them, you find a morality that is certainly not Christian. Is because it couldn't be, because it wasn't. It was pre-Christian in time. So the Medici were closely associated with that. So when they go, there's a power vacuum, and that allows the pendulum effect to operate. So there is a reaction that ended up being violent, a violent reaction against Renaissance humanism. And the exact opposite of secular paganized humanism is a religious theocracy. And that's what happened in Florence. And we're going to see what happened but just keep that in mind when we're going to get to Savonarola. In any case, sticking with the chronology, King Charles VIII continued marching south until he reached Naples. He forced Alfonso II to abdicate and had himself crowned King of Naples on February 22nd, 1495. Pope Alexander VI had been forced to agree to humiliating peace terms and to recognize the right of Charles VIII to the throne of Naples because he didn't have sufficient troops to oppose him. But it stuck in his craw. So he just even though he agreed to this clandestinely, he worked behind Charles's back to form what in retrospect turned out to be the foundation for a proto-nationalist Italian alliance. And by nationalist, I mean those who, Italy for the Italians. No reaching, as we covered throughout the medieval period, the Germans, the French, the Spanish, then the Germans again, then the French again, then, one after another, even the Greeks for a time, that all were meddling in Italy, trying to divide it up among themselves, and pitting the Italians against each other, which artificially hindered the solidification of a unified kingdom. That's why Italy was politically behind France and England, and now at this point Spain, in that process of becoming a nation. So the army that Alexander VI was able to assemble by means of this alliance engaged and defeated the French at the Battle of Fornovo on July 6, 1495, 19 miles southwest of Parma, which is about 80 miles north and east of Florence. Charles's army was defeated, but he was not captured. And his army was not completely destroyed, but it was definitely a tactical victory for the Italians, and largely strategic. Even though Charles was able to withdraw with a viable military force, it was not enough for him to do what he would have needed to do to take all of Italy. So he left. He left Naples, went back to France. Meanwhile, some mariners who had sailed with Columbus were from Naples. Naples was a seaport, and like Columbus himself. Now he was from Genoa, which is northwest Italy, but these young men who were born in these Italian port cities often made their living on the sea. So it was not unusual, that Columbus would hire, such men to, that would just take a job, to sailing with it. Well, they came home, and some were on his first and his second voyage. I want this to be a family-friendly channel, so I have to phrase this delicately. So sailors, imagine sailors, they sail from Europe, and they land in what became known as the Americas, but on the Caribbean islands. There were no females on the ships with them while they were sailing for months at sea. When they land on the islands in the Caribbean, they did find females. As a result, some contracted a disease, subsequently named syphilis, from direct physical contact with the indigenous people of the New World. Upon returning home, they shared direct physical contact with people back home in Naples. And as a result, this disease was transmitted to them. So they were the vector for this disease, this condition called syphilis. And then it spread, because the people that they had contact with would have contact with others, and they with others and others. So that's epidemiology. Elements of the French army who, remember, they were in Naples too. So when Charles initially achieved success and conquered Naples, these troops from France are also in Naples as a garrison force. Well, once they achieve victory, then they get bored, and they just on their time off they go around the city of Naples, and they also engaged in close physical contact with individuals in Naples, some of whom had engaged in close physical contact with the mariners of Columbus. So that's, in this way, the first recorded outbreak of syphilis occurred in the history of Western Europe. It was named. It comes from a. Anyway, in its first. No, I'll put it this way. Yes, it goes through 3 stages. In its first stage, it manifests as ulcerations on the skin. In its second stage, is a rash. Then it can be latent, sometimes for years. But in its tertiary stage, it attacks the nervous system, and so in its tertiary stage, it can mimic insanity. And so there's some famous people in history who ended up having this disease, such as Henry VIII, and the English king. And that might explain, some of his behavior, especially later in his reign. Now, today, it can be treated with antibiotics, at least in its first primary, and I think even the secondary stage. It was called the French disease, associated with the French army, because shortly after many contracted it, then events turned. Alexander managed to outmaneuver Charles and defeat him at the Battle of Fornovo. So they returned back home, and they brought this disease with them. Now, it wasn't the French who called it the French disease. It was an Italian who wrote a poem about it, in which the title character was named Syphilis. And he was a shepherd. And in the poem, he's the first one to manifest the disease, although that's not exactly how it happened. So, keeping all of this in mind provides background to better understand Savonarola. Between 1494 and 1498, so 4 years, Florence, the cradle of Renaissance humanism, was governed as a theocracy, meaning a direct government by religious, fanatical religious. The reaction was led by a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. So the first name, Girolamo. Surname, Savonarola, Savonarola. Born in 1452 in the city of Ferrara, 75 miles northeast of Florence, 55 miles southwest of Venice. So between Florence and Venice. He led a largely meaningless life as a youth, but then he discovered his vocation at the age of 22 after hearing a sermon on repentance preached by a Dominican friar on a mission, mission rounds. So he decided to join the Dominicans. He embraced a life of severe penance and asceticism. In the year 1482, the order, the Dominicans, assigned him to the priory of San Marco in Florence. He arrived when Renaissance humanism, with its pagan morality, was in full bloom. He was appalled by the flagrant immorality, the rampant promiscuity, the daily and public blasphemy against the faith, taken as hilariously funny. Worst of all, from his perspective, is what he saw as the obsessive idealization of ancient Greece and Rome, pre-Christian Greece and Rome, as a revival, because that's what it was, a revival of ancient pagan arts and literature led to a revival of ancient pagan morality. In other words, he believed that Renaissance humanism was nothing less than a relapse of an entire society from Christendom back into paganism. So he saw the Renaissance as a way that the pagans converted the Christians back to paganism. He began preaching. As remember that in the medieval course that's the whole charism is preaching. So he began preaching in 1490 against this religious disintegration. He attracted a following among the silent majority, among the faithful, who felt increasingly isolated. They also were appalled, at what was at the behavior that they were witnessing. Especially the adults who saw so many of their children, as they weaned away from the faith by the temptations of this Renaissance humanism. At the moment, at that point, in 1490 and early 90s, the majority in the city, at least those with power, those with money and power, still followed the lead of the Medici patrons of humanism. But, linking back to what we said earlier, in 1494, Charles VIII invaded Italy. The Medici picked the wrong side, and they had to evacuate Florence. And so there was nobody in charge. That was their moment. Savonarola and his adherents took that opportunity to take over the Signoria, the city council in Florence, to establish it's ironic that they called it a republic, since that's what pre-Christian Rome was, a republic. But anyway, that's what they called it. They established a republic to replace the family merchant oligarchy that had evolved, which was the way that the Medici had maintained control. Savonarola was not an elected member of the Signoria, of the city council of this new republic, but in the early years, a majority, almost everyone, not quite everyone, but a majority were his followers. And the ones who were not his direct followers, were not disposed to fight him at that point. They produced a constitution and passed laws, policies, etc., clearly inspired by him, that created a theocracy, a religious government, that aggressively, intentionally purged all elements of Renaissance humanism. So in the cradle of the Renaissance, you have this where they're trying to wipe it out. They're trying to exterminate it. For example, he inspired a group in the city to become a moral police force, to lack of a better word. It wasn't police the way we think of as, a uniform group supported by municipal taxes, but it was a coherent group that self-understood itself as being enforcers of Catholic morality in a place where that was largely absent for a few generations. Savannah was, as far as can be traced through his public speeches, the first to publicly denounce much of Renaissance art as, now he didn't use this word, that's just a later word, but what we would call today pornographic. And in pursuit of this and trying to remove this, the theocracy engaged in censorship and confiscations. They confiscated all at first it was all paintings and statues that render the human form unclothed, nude. In other words, paintings with nude figures or sculptures of a nude figure. They also confiscated any writings, whether poetry or prose, literature, plays, in which extolled pagan myths or stories which they saw as prurient, as immoral, and they burned them, they destroyed them. I mean, they conducted regular public burnings, so that the purge, deliberately trying to purge through censorship these works of art that they regarded as debased, as pagan. Well, Florence is not that big. I mean, you could walk across it in 20 minutes. So, eventually, and not every single person had this kind of art, because not everybody could afford it. So, eventually, it worked. They managed to get and destroy everything they could get their hands on. Now, there were many, like the Medici, who had evacuated before they took over, and they took their stuff with them. So that's how some of the things survived. But they managed to get everything, otherwise. So that then now what are we going to do? So then they expand their efforts to include burning playing cards. Like the decks of cards where you'd play whatever games people play with cards. I have not internalized the history of that. I don't know if they were playing poker yet, or blackjack, or I don't know, whatever, but cards. They confiscated those. They then confiscated musical instruments, not all of them, but those that were constructed along classical models. And then they expanded even further, confiscating paintings which had in them pagan temples, or there were paintings about pagan myths, even if they contained no nudity. So the first round they confiscated was any with the human figure unclothed. Then they expanded if it's pagan. If you have a painting with Apollo in it, even if he's wearing a tunic, well, okay, get that and burn it. Okay, again, it's a small city, so that once they finish all that, okay, now what are we going to do? Well, then they expand. So next they had to protect the people from relapse by insulating them from the near occasion of sin. So theaters and taverns were closed. The bars, taverns are bars, and theaters, well, you know what those are. Okay, now what? All right, all that's done. Close all that. Well, okay. Well, what if people were still engaging in these behaviors behind closed doors? So the next step is informants. Rewards were offered for information leading to the identification of anyone engaged in pagan behavior. And those people were punished with public flogging, or public shaming, being put in the stocks overnight, or sometimes both. They'd be flogged and put in the stocks, or put in the stocks and flogged. And anyway, so trying to exterminate the Renaissance. Now, if all of this had been attempted a century earlier, it might have worked. But by the 1490s, it was too late. Renaissance humanism had spread far beyond Florence. So even if they did exterminate it in Florence, even if they wiped out Florence, if they just burned down the whole city, it still would have been too late, because the too many had studied in Florence and then went and spread it around, not only in Italy, but also in France and Austria and Spain. So it was too late to undo it. Nevertheless, from his perspective, in Florence in the 1490s, Savonarola was very pleased. He was satisfied that the movement was making real progress toward moral reform. Well, if it could work in one city, why not the whole church? So then his sermon shifted from what they had been previously, very specific targeted attacks against the revival of paganism and immorality. Well, now in that one city, well, now they expand to denouncing corruption in general, including corruption in the church, which invariably led to highlighting the behavior of the Pope, Alexander VI, with his at least 4 illegitimate children. Now, Alexander never once in his entire earthly existence demonstrated the slightest concern for what other people thought of his moral life. However, when Savonarola began delivering prophecies of the end of the world, remember that from the medieval course, Joachim of Fior, the millenarians, and that keeps recurring periodically, meaning the second coming of Christ. Then people outside of the city really started to take notice. In 1490, I remember Savonarola is a priest. He's a Dominican in a religious order, so he's bound by obedience. He's not. There's no freedom of speech. Well, nobody had freedom of speech because none of these places are democracies, but for a priest, there was even less. So in 1495, Savonarola was summoned to Rome by the Inquisition. As you remember, way back when we talked about Joachim of Fior and the millenarians, one of the public revelation ended with the death of the last apostle. So the Bible has what we need. All church teaching can be traced ultimately to the Bible. Now, God is still free, of course, and the Blessed Mother and saints. So private revelations have occurred. And one of the criteria the church uses to say that this is worthy of belief or not is whether or not the person asserting it claims to have new knowledge that was not revealed in the Bible. As if you look at all of the private revelations that have been declared worthy of belief, there's nothing new in them really. I mean, they're reminders that calls back to fidelity to Jesus. Even the apparitions of the Blessed Mother, she talks about prayer and fasting. Well, it's not new. It's a reminder. But if someone claims something new, like Joachim of Fior, he was one. He said, okay, the world's going to end in 1260. Well, Jesus didn't say that, so he's claiming to have knowledge about the end of the world that Jesus either didn't know or he just forgot to tell us in the Bible. So, of course, that's a basis for condemnation. Well, now Savonarola, when he's talking about that, the end of the world, now he didn't put a date to it because that would have been too obvious. That's an immediate condemnation. But still, he had to go and, they were asking, what is this? Are you claiming a revelation? Or is it just a general, okay, yeah, eventually the world's going to end, and if nothing else, our lives are going to end. That is an absolute definite. And, so if he's just making it in those general terms to call people back to moral reform, all right, then that's permissible. But they had to know what was he doing. So they call him up to Rome. Now, up to this point in 1495, Savonarola had been extreme, but still orthodox in his moral preaching. But his response to this summons in 1495 was the first step in taking him outside of the church. And that was the step of disobedience. He refused. He refused the summons to go to Rome. So the Inquisition followed routine procedure and banned Savonarola from teaching and preaching until his orthodoxy could be verified. So, to use the canonical term, they removed his faculties to preach. So he's still a priest. Ordination is never undone, but priest, it's still like I can only say mass publicly and preach because I have faculties from the archbishop. If those are removed, those faculties are removed, I'm still a priest. I'm still ordained, but I cannot legitimately practice publicly without those faculties, and the same with Savonarola. But again, for the second time, he disobeyed. So he disobeyed the summons to Rome, and then when his faculties were rescinded, he continued preaching. So that's a second disobedience. And he did it. Moreover, it was with particular venom directed against the church and against the Pope for trying to silence him, as he put it. And the consequence was inevitable. Savonarola was a man in vows who had moved into public disobedience. And part of those vows are a surrender of what we would call free. They wouldn't have called. Free speech was not something that was even discussed in the 15th century. But what we would say, like, if you become a priest, you really forfeit that. Even today, even when we do have the right of free speech, we cannot publicly say whatever we want if we're speaking in the name of the church. So he was excommunicated on the 13th of May, 1497. Still, he continued to preach openly, defiantly. Now, at this point, some of his followers who had previously been inspired by and embraced his program of moral purification were scandalized that a man who had preached religious zeal would so completely disregard the obedience and humility that were the foundations of religious life. That's one of the vows the religious take, poverty, chastity, and obedience. So the combination of the loss of his supporters with the loss of his religious credibility and his official status, his official ecclesiastical status, that allowed the many enemies he had made to act finally, and that resulted in his arrest. He was put to torture in order to extract a confession, but that was completely unnecessary. He was already excommunicated. He already had no legitimate authority. But they did it. So the torture was for revenge, because he made many enemies. The many people who were accused of being immoral, they were publicly flogged, which is, that's torture. The stocks, the public shaming, and you left in a stocks, for 2 or 3 days. That's torture. On the 25th of May, 1498, Savonarola was executed by hanging, and then his body was burned. Now, this wasn't done by the church. This was done by enemies he made in Florence. So he was hanged and then executed. Now, there can be no doubt he went too far. Yet his ability to attract so many followers to carry out such a complete moral reform in a city should have been taken as a warning that the Renaissance had also gone too far. But the warning was ignored. 1495, the same year that Savonarola, was first summoned and went into disobedience. Farther north in Europe, in 1495, we have occasion to be introduced to Hieronymus Bosch von Aachen. All right, Hieronymus, Hieronymous. That is a formal Latinized rendering of the name Jerome. Then the rest of his name, Bosch, Bosch, and Van, Van, Aachen, Aken. He lived from 1450 to 1516. The reason I'm talking about him at this point in 1495 is it's that year that he painted the Garden of Earthly Delights. That's the name of the work. So that's the same year that Charles VIII was crowned King of Naples, and the year after the Medici were expelled from Florence. All right, who's this guy? Hieronymus was a third-generation artist, born in Hertogenbosch in the Duchy of Brabant. That's the present-day Netherlands. That's the short way. It's present-day Netherlands. He was born about 65 miles east and south of Rotterdam. Deeply religious, even as a child and into adulthood. He never lost it. He joined a very conservative lay confraternity called the Brotherhood of Our Lady and made a comfortable living as an artist. A layman, still, he never became a priest. When success, artistic success, resulted in financial success, gave him some material liberty, he began considering the direction of his profession in general since the advent of humanism. And the Italian Renaissance art in particular. He became increasingly troubled at the promotion of pre-Christian art forms. And in that, he had that in common with Savonarola. But Savonarola was a preacher just denounced, whereas Bosch was an artist. So, he didn't stop being an artist. But instead, he thought, well, okay, he'll use his talent to create what may be the first artistic critique of the Renaissance. And that is the Garden of Earthly Delights, plural. It is a triptych. I don't have... actually, hold on. No, I don't have anything. A triptych is as the name three, as the name suggests, it's three. So imagine you have this, but instead of a diptych, which is two parts, it's in three parts. It opens in three, but then you can fold it back, closed, and then have a work of art on the outside, sometimes both sides. So you have one thing here, but then you can open up the doors, and then you have three on the inside. So it's a big deal. I mean, it's a lot of work to do something like this. All right, so his triptych consisted of 3 panels of oak wood, hinged such that 2 panels folded inward to cover the third. When closed, on the outside was a work of art that he painted. It was a monochromatic sphere representing the primordial act of creation. When opened, the 3 panels on the inside depicted a polychromatic, multicolored work of art reflecting the changes in God's creation wrought by man, by us. So the left inner panel, when looking at it open, the left, is a rendering of the Garden of Eden prior to the sin of disobedience. The central panel shows the fall of humanity, indulging every sensual desire without regard for the sin which caused the fall, and as a consequence of it. So that he's picking those sins in particular because that's like the critique of the Renaissance morality. The right panel depicts the consequences of such living, which is the torments of hell. So that's Savonarola was not the only one that feared the moral damage caused by a revival of paganism. In the same year, as if to mock them both, Savonarola and Hieronymus Bosch, a guy in his professional name, he rendered it in Latin, Aldus Manutius, Aldus, and his last name, Manutius. He began a series of printed editions of the ancient Greco-Roman classics. He started with the Greek classics in 1495. So he's printing, meaning making more available to a wider audience, more of the text that these critics of the Renaissance saw as the problem. He started with the a five-volume folio of Aristotle. Same year, 1495, we have yet another reaction, but on a different level. In 1495, Francisco Jimenez y Cisneros became the 80th Archbishop of Toledo in Spain and Primate of Spain. Okay, so Francisco, yeah, I'm sure you know how to spell that. So Francisco Jimenez, and the way it was spelled then, now would be with a J, but then it was Ximenez, then the Y-E, which means and. So it's both, it's the father's family and the mother's family. So Jimenez y Cisneros, Cisneros, a remarkable figure in the history of Spain. He's not as well known as the English in the English-speaking world as he should be. He provided a solution to the problem of Renaissance humanism that was not as extreme as Savonarola, because Cisneros always remained obedient to the church, but it was more effective than Hieronymus Bosch, as Bosch was just an individual, just doing a critique on his own. And Jimenez y Cisneros showed that it was possible to reverse the damage of feudalism and the Renaissance. And he did it while being a cardinal. Well, I mean, he started before that, but he ended up being a prince of the church, like so many of those who gave in to their temptation. So he proved he could do it, even subject to all the temptations. All right, so who is this guy? Born in Castile, Spain, 1436, Francisco studied at the University of Salamanca in Spain, a Dominican school, and then in Rome. After that, he returned to Spain as a priest in 1473. He was appalled by the corruption and the immorality he observed, and in his youth, he exercised no restraint over his speech. Now, he never became disobedient like Savonarola did. And at this early stage, he didn't have the power to do any kind of, confiscations and burnings of art. But he did denounce what he saw as corruption. And what got him into trouble and cost him a great deal is he was attacking his fellow clergy and those above him, because he's newly ordained priest. So he's attacking those above him for neglecting their duties. The problem of the multiple benefices with care of souls, and then they weren't fulfilling the care of souls. All those problems that we've been talking about, since Bede, since we talked about Bede. Now, not everybody likes to be criticized like in that way publicly. So some of these local clergy were afraid that he would attract undesirable attention. So they conspired. What do you do then? Well, okay, you make up a false. So they accused him. They just as they did with Jesus and Stephen. I mean, they just made up some specious charge. They accused him of attempting to poach a benefice, and then just arrested him. Just put him in a dungeon. Now, since he was not actually guilty of anything, they could not risk a trial. So he was simply left in a dungeon without trial. And having been away from Castile for years, as he was studying in Rome, and he had no important family connections, so he was just stuck, falsely in prison, wrongly in prison, no trial, no conviction, for 7 years. He was released in 1480 by accident. The building, the prison building, the dungeon was gonna be torn down to make room for a new building, and no one could remember what he was in prison for. And this time he kept his mouth shut, so they just let him go. These years, 7 years, wasted years of his youth that you never get back. Years of isolation, of darkness, of privation, of injustice had changed him. His faith had deepened with sadness. And the lesson in the depth of human sinfulness and cruelty gave him a profound lesson in humility as well as prudence. The bishop of Siguenza learned of his plight and gave him a job in the office of the vicar general. Francisco took it, but it was just a task for him. I mean, he could never muster any interest in staff work. So after less than a year, he requested, and the bishop facilitated that request, for him to enter the Franciscans. As a Franciscan, he lived a life of asceticism, meditation, the corporal works of mercy, working with the poor. That was the Franciscan thing, their charism. And he was content with doing that for the rest of his life. But God was not finished with him yet. In the course of these 11 years as a Franciscan friar, his reputation for holiness and sincerity brought many to him for confession and what we would call today spiritual direction. One of those was the Bishop of Siguenza, who had helped him and, followed his progress over the years. In 1482, that Bishop of Siguenza became a cardinal. His name was Pedro Gonzalez de Mendoza, Mendoza, became the 79th Archbishop of Toledo, 50 miles southwest of Madrid in Spain. Mendoza was what would have been called then a worldly cleric. I mean, he was a decent, human being. He loved God, was profoundly loyal to Queen Isabel of Castile and Leon, and her vision of a united Catholic Spain. And this connection resulted in a shocking appointment for the Friar Francisco. In 1492, he became, at Cardinal Mendoza's recommendation, the personal confessor for Queen Isabel. She was so impressed with him that when Cardinal Mendoza died 3 years later, in 1495, she recommended to the Pope that Friar Francisco take his place and become Archbishop of Toledo and Primate of Spain. He was horrified, and he instantly refused. His one brief exposure to work on a bishop's staff showed him that he was not suited for such work. And his 7 years in prison, and by this point it's up to 14 years as a Franciscan ascetic, left him unfamiliar with events in the world. But Isabel insisted. And Isabel, she was very determined. She usually got her way. And in the one redeeming spiritual act of his pontificate, Pope Alexander VI commanded Francisco, under holy obedience, to accept the position. Now, Isabel did not want just another loyal follower, like Cardinal Mendoza had been, very loyal to her, and he was very effective in temporal matters. But spiritually, he was one of those, the feudalism thing. He had just been sent into the church by his family, and he was loyal to the church. He did his duty. There was no illegitimate children or anything like that. But still, he was not nor would he have claimed to be any kind of a spiritual master. What Isabel wanted, was for every priest in Spain to be holy, to be righteous, to be zealous. She believed that Jimenez y Cisneros was the man to accomplish it. She got to know him as confessor, and she saw the fruits of his work as a Franciscan friar. So to put it another way, she wanted every priest in Spain to be like that. Going from a sort of cloistered life, the Franciscan, he wasn't really cloistered in the sense that, of not being, because he was engaged in ministry, but it was a semi-cloistered life. It was just, but he had no political experience. I'll put it that way. From that to overnight becoming Archbishop and Primate of the country, what must have been profoundly jarring. Not as bad as 7 years of unjust imprisonment in a cage underground, but still jarring. But he had the total support of Queen Isabel, And that was not, she did not make empty promises. When she promised, she fulfilled it. So with her support, he developed a program that made Spain the most devoutly Catholic country in Europe and would leave Spain completely untouched by the Protestant movement. It consisted of, first, clerical education as the foundation for his reform, because they were teachers of the faith. The priests were teachers of the faith, whom the faithful would come, with whom the faithful would come into most direct contact. They might see their bishop a few times in their life, depending on when they lived. I mean, if they lived in the capital, if they lived in the cathedral city, they might see him more regularly. But other than that, they might either never see him at all, or maybe only see him once or twice in their lifetime. He established the University of Alcalá to become a center of higher learning that was imbued with the faith and not distracted by the agendas of universities such as the Sorbonne in Paris, which we covered in the medieval course. Second, scripture and preaching were the core elements of this clerical education. In this, he presented an ecclesial solution to Renaissance humanism. Study of ancient languages and recovery of ancient manuscripts could both be good endeavors if they were ordered to a higher purpose. For him, that higher purpose was coming to a deeper awareness of the divine law as revealed in Scripture, as well as the Church Fathers. He sponsored what was called a polyglot at the time, now we'd say multilingual, Bible, to further this objective. It consisted of parallel columns of biblical text. In each column was a different language. And it was an achievement that had not been seen since the hexapla of Origen, which had been so important for St. Jerome's biblical research. But the hexapla was lost in antiquity. It was burned by Pelagian heretics who attacked St. Jerome for denouncing them as heretics. So the Origen's hexapla was gone. But the polyglot, the Complutensian polyglot Bible that Cardinal Jimenez y Cisneros sponsored survives. Third, clerical lifestyle, celibacy, residence, and service in a benefice, if that benefice had cura animorum, care of souls, regular prayer, fulfilling the duties of sacramental life. It's pretty clear, but because of the nepotism problem, the feudalism problem, compounded by the Renaissance problem, as we've seen, it was often ignored. Fourth, religious orders. Like the secular clergy, or what we would call now diocesan clergy, many religious orders had succumbed to the temptations of concupiscence and sloth during the generations of neglect fostered by the feudalism problem. Now, he did not live long enough to fix all religious orders in Spain, but he made a solid start in doing regular visitations, forcing the orders of men and women to actually live under the rule of their particular community, whatever that was. Whether it was Benedictine, or whether it was one of the military orders, or whether it was the more recent ones, Dominican, Franciscan, Augustinian, Carmelite. The results of his efforts can be seen in the first generation of Franciscan missionaries to the New World, whose dedication and zeal, and in some cases martyrdoms, resulted in grammars in the indigenous languages, pictorial catechisms for use by lay catechists to instruct the faithful whom they could not directly reach. Fifth, financial reforms. Okay, now this one is going to seem kind of out there because it's something that the church could not even do in the American system. So by way of background, recall from the medieval course, the military religious orders inadvertently, but just by early practices, fostered the development of the construct of international banking. Well, other religious orders, and then later other dioceses, the hierarchical clergy, did the same. Not every single one, but that it was a practice in which ecclesial institutions functioned as banks, meaning loaning money, for anyway. So he forbade that practice. He forbade, as primate of the country, with Isabel, with the Queen's support, he forbade the parishes, monasteries, convents from that dangerous practice of loaning money in exchange for use of land, herds of livestock, or some other service. Partially because it was an informal arrangement without controls. There were no laws governing this. So, meaning it was too easy to abuse. I mean, sometimes a handshake deal can work, but, people are people. So, and sin exists. So, not always. And he knew from observation, from experience, how often it in fact was abused. So he just forbade it, period. Sixth, spirituality. He had learned through 7 years of wrongful imprisonment that a person can endure a great deal, more than a person would think if you just posed it to them as a hypothetical. A person can endure a great deal if that person has faith and understands that a person of faith is spiritually never alone, because Jesus also suffered unjustly. So that certainty of spiritual communion comes from constant, intentional, spiritual connection with the divine through practices of the faith, through spiritual practices. Now, I mean, sometimes you can actually just go celebrate the sacraments, but like if someone can't, such as in his case when he was in prison, and you're just not free to do that, there's still things that practices can be done. You still can do prayer, and you still can engage in practices of mortification, which, partially is that's some of the things he did. The purpose being mastery of the self. Because so many of the obstructions, the barriers between us and God, the relationship with God, are not put there by God. They're put there by us. Now, there's some from the world, of course. The world does insert temptations. There's no denying that. But it's our surrendering to those temptations that turn it from just a transient distraction into a major temptation, and then into a sin. So then from a wall, it becomes a pit. So the purpose of these one of the purposes of the practice is to maintain the connection with God, and the fruits of that connection with God is being able to resist those temptations by mastery of the self. The other side of his spirituality was a profound devotion to the Blessed Mother, and that formed a centerpiece of the spirituality he offered to the young man whom he inspired to become priest. And devotion to Our Lady. And so that all these things characterized Catholicism in Spain. Just at the time when Spain became fully Catholic, after reconquering the last part of it from the Muslims. So these characteristics of Spanish Catholicism, I mean, it's, of course, I don't want to overstate and say it's not 100% him, and he would have been the first to say no, but the movement he set in motion, and the support from the monarch that made it stick for generations. That's why Spanish Catholicism is so characterized by devotion to Our Lady, by the spiritual practice, by the devotional practices, the rosary, the novenas, the processions, because that's what he saw as important in maintaining that connection with the divine. So he inspired thousands, both those who became priests and religious as well as the laity. For example, in 1509, this is his idea of a men's club meeting. He led a group of volunteers on a military expedition across the Strait of Gibraltar into Morocco, which is a Muslim country, so it had slave markets, as according Muslim, and in order to liberate those held at the infamous slave market in Iran, most of whom would be Christian. And they freed him, so that was just like an impromptu thing. That's what his men's club meetings did. This is go attack and liberate a slave market. Okay, time passed. On the 23rd of January, 1516, King Ferdinand died, and Isabel already died before him. So that left, and in his will, this shows the respect that he had. Ferdinand, when he died, left Cardinal Cisneros as regent of Castile for the heir, who was 16 years old, Carlos, who became the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, about whom we will have much more to say. In September of 1517, Charles landed in Spain. He was in the Netherlands when Ferdinand died, so he had to come back. In September of 1517, he landed in Spain, and the cardinal went out to meet him. On November 8th, 1517, the cardinal died. He was poisoned, evidently by a conspiracy, of those who did not want, the church to be disciplined. And they felt it was safe to do it now that both Ferdinand and Isabel were deceased. He never learned, Cardinal Cisneros never learned, that 8 days prior, an Augustinian priest named Martin Luther had nailed up a debate challenge of 95 articles onto the church door in Wittenberg, triggering the Protestant movement. But he died, obviously, and 8 days was not enough time for the news to travel, certainly not understand the significance of it. It's a pity that he did die when he did, because Charles, the guy who became Charles V, would have a very long and very difficult life, in part because he spent all of his reign battling the Protestant movement, and he could have benefited from the wisdom and the spiritual support of Cisneros, who had immunized an entire country. I mean, Spain was untouched by the Protestant movement. That's how successful these reforms were. Okay, now, who is this Charles V? To rewind, in 1496, a guy named Philip the Handsome. That's one translates, Philip the Fair or Philip the Handsome. But it's Philippe von Habsburg. So he's of the House of Habsburg. That's a significant thing. He was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. As part of a political alliance, the Emperor Maximilian arranged for his son and heir, Philippe, to marry a Spanish princess, Juana of the House of Trastamara. She was a daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel. Their son was Carlos, who became Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So he inherited, as we'll see, the Habsburg holdings as well as the Trastamara holdings. So he became a superpower in his day. But at this point, we'll leave him at age 16 and we'll meet him again. Okay, to see what else is going on. The Renaissance, while it undeniably did do many of the things that Savonarola and Bosch and Cisneros accused it of, it was not all bad, because part of the Renaissance was recovering techniques of painting, of sculpture, and of architecture that had been lost. Now, there were some of the artists in the Renaissance who mastered those techniques, who used them to render, to just copy and pagan art. But not all of them did. There were those who used those skills to render sacred art, and in their own way changed history. For example, in November of 1497, a French cardinal, Cardinal Jean de Bilheret of Gascony, France, commissioned Michelangelo Buonarroti to sculpt a piece of sacred art for his own burial chapel. Like today we buy a funeral policy, to plan so our heirs or, whoever, somebody else doesn't have to do it. Well, that's what the cardinal was doing. And he wanted to make a crypt for himself, and he wanted Michelangelo to create a piece of art. And he wanted it to have something to do with Mary. The result was the Pietà. As we'll get to in the reign of a future pope, there was a St. Peter's Basilica there in 1497. Now, the one that was there is not the one that's there now, but it was on the same site. And as we'll see in the reign of a future pope, that original one, the one that existed in 1497, was torn down, and it was replaced with the one we have now. But the cardinal wanted it. You have side altars in church. Well, the cardinal he wanted a little funeral chapel outside of the original St. Peter's. When the current St. Peter's was built on the same site, it's much longer. So that space was incorporated into the footprint of the existing St. Peter's. And as a memory of that, the Pietà is still in a side chapel of the current St. Peter's Basilica. Now, it's behind a bulletproof glass because some idiot, attacked it with a hammer. I don't know if you remember that. It was just disgusting. Anyway, okay, so Michelangelo sculpted the Pietà. The Pietà is the supreme example of Renaissance sculpture, demonstrating that the new art style, the new techniques, which are not new techniques, but came as a revival of the ancient techniques that have been forgotten, did not have to be used in a degrading way. It did not have to be used to just revive pagan art. It instead could be used to glorify God. Specifically, in this piece, Michelangelo sculpted the Blessed Mother as a young woman, even though by the time Jesus was murdered, she would, no longer have been young. Michelangelo was challenged on this inaccuracy, but he didn't care. Second, connected to it, it's the second point, but he was never one to care about anyone's opinions, but he did respond. He was also not one to take criticism without response. So he replied that the face represented his mental image of one who had been endowed with grace beyond any other mortal, had lived free of sin, and had maintained perpetual virginity. So that was his explanation for why he carved the face so beautiful. Third, now Michelangelo is one of those figures that, he could have been denounced by Savonarola, because in many of his arts, many of his works of art, both sculpture and painting, he does render the human form nude, including biblical figures. Yet when he sculpted Jesus in the Pietà, Jesus was covered. I mean, it was a loincloth. He wasn't covered, neck to ankles, but he did have a loincloth. And of course, there was never any indication that it even occurred to him to render the Blessed Mother in any other way than fully clothed. Coincidentally, Michelangelo was only in Rome because of Savonarola. When Savonarola took control of Florence, because Michelangelo had a history of doing paintings and sculpture of nude figures, it was no longer safe for him to be in Rome. So that's why he had to leave. No longer safe for him to be in Florence. So he was unemployed. He was looking for a job, and then the cardinal hires him to do this, and so that's how he got in Rome. And we'll meet him again. On November 22nd, 1497, Vasco da Gama, sailing for the crown of Portugal, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, as I alluded to earlier, but this is where it fits in the chronology, finally charting a sea route from Lisbon, Portugal, to the western coast of India, to Goa. Same year, 1497, Venetian mariners, sailing for the King of England, Henry VII, reached the east coast of North America. This is John and Sebastian Cabot. That's how they were Italian. It was Cabato, but that's how they rendered in English history books as Cabot. The following year, 1498, another one of these Renaissance artists who used the skills actually for both. He also had a history that Savonarola would not have appreciated, but he also rendered sacred art. Leonardo da Vinci in 1498 completed one of the most famous pieces of sacred art in the world, The Last Supper. It is located in the refectory of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Rome, Our Lady of Grace, in Milan. It was the convent was constructed under the patronage of Francisco Sforza, the Duke of Milan, to serve as the burial church for his family. The convent was completed in 1469. Ludovico Sforza later paid for Da Vinci to paint The Last Supper in the refectory of the convent, we'd say cafeteria, the place where they would eat. But when in a convent, when they ate, they would eat in silence. I mean, they wouldn't talk, but they would listen to spiritual readings or biblical readings. So refectory. Da Vinci depicted in his rendering of the Last Supper, he depicted the moment of consternation reflected in the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verse 21, in which Jesus said, "Amen, amen, I say to you, one of you will betray me." So then they look at each other and they say, so that's the moment, when they're all talking to each other. So the 12 apostles are presented in groups of 3, conferring with each other. Oh, who do you think it's going to be? Well, it's not going to be me, And those groups of 3 are matched by 3 windows and behind them, overlooking a hilly countryside. And this group, the groups of 3s, leaves Jesus alone in the middle, at the very moment when all the apostles are declaring their loyalty to him and seeking to assure him and to assure each other and themselves that they would not be the traitor. So there's the multiple levels of irony. The highest head in the setting is that of Peter, to the right of the frame, looking at it to the right, to the left of Jesus. The lowest head is Judas, on the left of the frame. And you could actually draw a line from Peter's eyes to Judas's eyes, and that line would go directly through Jesus's eyes. And there's the detail, Judas is actually holding his bag of blood money while Peter's looking at him. Now, though they are not making eye contact, Judas and Jesus are both reaching for the same piece of bread. Jesus with his right hand, Judas with his left. Now, Da Vinci. Da Vinci is a village outside of Florence, so Da Vinci was basically raised in Florence. He was both blessed and afflicted with a wide-ranging and unquenchable curiosity. Today, as a child, he probably would have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and anesthetized with medication, and we would have never heard of him. But absent that, he was able to devote this obsessive focus, to creativity. But he lacked the discipline to focus on one project to completion, at a time. So this is why why somebody like Michelangelo had such a staggering output of completed works, whereas Da Vinci did not. He did complete some things, of course, but he does not have, considering how long he lived and considering the talent that he had, he does not have the body of work that someone like Michelangelo had, or later Bernini had. Because he was a genius, there was no doubt about it. But he had too many interests, and so it really did have ADD. I mean, I don't want to make him. He was a genius with ADD. Yeah. So, for example, it took Michelangelo 4 years to paint the entire ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And we'll get to that later. Maybe not in this, but we'll get to it later. It took Da Vinci the same amount of time, 4 years, just to paint the Last Supper. One painting on one wall above a door. Whereas in the same amount of time, Michelangelo covered the entire ceiling of the Sistine with 343 figures. This weakness eliminated the fresco style from Leonardo da Vinci's repertoire. So recall, I forgot what I talked about with what class, so forgive me if this is a repetition. But the word fresco is the Italian word for fresh. So it described a process of painting where a coat of plaster would be put on the wall. And while it's still wet, meaning fresh, the artist had to paint on the plaster, the goal being that the paint and the plaster would dry together. And that makes it, it's more long-lasting, which is why some of the frescoes are still so bright after 500 years later. But it's very demanding. I mean, the pace is like you can't put the plaster on too much of the wall. You can only put it on as much as you think you can paint before it dries. Well, Da Vinci just couldn't handle that kind of pace. So instead, the Last Supper is the other way to paint a wall, which is just a mural. And that means you just paint whatever surface the wall is. You just put the paint on that wall. So he didn't have to worry about getting the painting done before the plaster dried. The result is that the Last Supper suffered rapid deterioration. Otherwise, it is still a masterpiece that can still be seen, and it is one of the most widely reproduced pieces of art in Catholic history. But sadly, the original is not as well preserved as some frescoes of the same period, like the Sistine Chapel. 1498, Columbus made his third voyage to the New World. He discovered the Orinoco River in present-day Venezuela. Vasco da Gama, in the same year, the Portuguese mariner, arrived on the Malabar coast of India. And the following year, 1499, the first successful emancipation movement of a colony in Western history. Now, this is what would be called an internal colony, meaning it was a colony of one European power, but it was within the confines of Europe. Specifically, what the ancient Romans called Helvetia, what is now Switzerland, was part of the Holy Roman Empire, a subordinate part So it was an internal colony. It was in Europe, but it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. So it was like a colony, a subordinate colony of the Holy Roman Empire. As was Bohemia, the present-day Czech Republic. In the previous century, the Bohemia tried 3 times to secede from the empire and gain its independence. Each time it was brutally crushed. So Switzerland tried it on their own, but they succeeded. They were the first to succeed and gain their independence. So that's 1499, Swiss emancipation from the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, the region that is Switzerland on today's maps was Helvetia on the ancient Roman imperial maps. Helvetia refers to the first tribe, well, at least the way the Latin ear heard the name of the first tribe they encountered in the region. After the fall of the Western Empire in 476, a Scandinavian barbarian tribe set up the kingdom of Burgundy, which encompassed eastern France as well as Switzerland. That Duchy of Burgundy was Kingdom of Burgundy, Duchy. It changed names, but that region was absorbed into the Holy Roman Empire. It was subdivided into a collection of originally 13 cantons. Cantons. That just means corner, a corner, or in the sense of like a district. A collection of 13 cantons had achieved legal recognition within the Holy Roman Empire as subordinate cities or regions in the empire. Instead of being called duchies or counties or baronies or margravites, they're just called cantons. In January of 1499, these 13 cantons united to form the Swiss Confederation for the purpose of achieving emancipation from the Austrian Habsburgs who controlled the Holy Roman Empire. This led to the War of the Swabian League versus the Swiss Confederation. It was a war. From the German perspective, it would be a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire. From the Swiss perspective, it was their war of independence. The Eidgenossenschaft is the word for an oath fellowship. And that oath, the Eidgenossenschaft, that is what bound the 13 cantons together. A member of this Eidgenossenschaft was called an Eidgenossen-sich. That suffix sich is or believe it or not, that's the origin of the word Swiss to English and German speakers, or Suisse to French speakers. The war culminated in the Battle of Dornach on the 22nd of July, 1499, in which the Swiss cantons defeated the armies of Maximilian I, forcing him to recognize their autonomy at the Treaty of Basel, Basle, this is the name of a town, on September 22nd, 1499. They remained officially part of the empire until 1648, but from 1499 on, they enjoyed internal self-governance and freedom from tax theft. Well, I should say freedom from imperial tax theft. Then the Swiss engaged in tax theft against their own people, because that's just what happens. This stunning achievement of de facto independence gave the Swiss an enviable reputation as soldiers, leading to their renting themselves out as mercenary companies, in effect advertising themselves as condottieri, who, unlike others, were actually loyal and would keep their word. This is the remote background for the Swiss Guard, which still serves the Vatican. Switzerland, of course, at the time it was Catholic. As we'll see, it's religiously is going to become divided by the Protestant movement between Catholic and Protestant. Today, there are 26 cantons. In 1500, a Portuguese mariner, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, discovered Brazil and claimed it for Portugal. And Amerigo Vespucci, for whom the Americas are named, he was actually was from Florence, an Italian mariner, but he took contracts working for other people. He discovered the mouth of the Amazon. The next year, 1501, Michelangelo was back in Florence after Savonarola was dead, and he had finished sculpting the Pietà. He had some money, from the French cardinal. The city council of Florence, the Signoria, wanted to assert its own, reassert its own independence, so to speak. And I shouldn't say that because that has a very specific meaning, but wanted to put Savonarola behind them. Wanted to assert that was definitely over with, and the stifling of artistic expression that went on under the Theocracy, from their perspective. And at that point, at 1501, that had been overthrown only 6 years earlier. In this state of mind, the Signoria, the council in Florence, commissioned Michelangelo to sculpt David, King David from the Old Testament, in a defiant pose to present a visual assertion of this attitude. We are still here, The result was a 17-foot tall nude statue of David. This is not the first sculpture of David, but previously, David had been sculpted in a posture of victory, with Goliath's head at his feet, and with Goliath's sword in his hand, or with Goliath's head and sword at his feet, but with the sling, in the hand, but some like after the deed was done. This was not. Instead, David was portrayed by Michelangelo at the moment of his decision to fight. Now, why nude? Well, Michelangelo was questioned about this, and he pointed out that in the account from the first book of Samuel, chapter 17, verses 38 to 40, King Saul initially armed David with a bronze helmet and coat of mail. But David took them off, because at this point he was still a shepherd. He wasn't used to wearing armor. Well, then the response was, just because he took the armor off doesn't mean he was nude when he faced Goliath. Michelangelo then replied, that God's plan includes human beings being born nude. And besides, Michelangelo wanted to convey the fearlessness of David based on his faith. 1 Samuel 17, verse 45. David said to Goliath, quote, "You come against me with sword and spear and scimitar, but I come against you in the name of the Lord." The original plan of the Signoria would have been that this statue would be placed on top of the east roof of the cathedral, which accounts for its large size. When the time came, though, when the thing was done, no one was quite prepared yet to put a 17-foot-tall naked guy on top of the church. Repudiation of Savonarola or not. So, on the 8th of September, 1504, it was displayed in the piazza in front of the main government building, which is also called the Signoria. The statue there now, the outdoor statue there now is a replica. The original was moved inside to protect it from the elements in the gallery of the Academy of Fine Arts in Florence. 1501, on November 4th. Arthur Tudor, that's Tudor, age 15, was the Prince of Wales, the heir to the English throne. He married, on that date, the 16-year-old Spanish princess Catherine of the House of Trastamara. She was the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel, whom we've already met. The ceremony took place in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was followed by 2 weeks of public festivities, the English version of bread and circuses. Princess Catherine was the great-granddaughter of Catherine of Lancaster, who was the daughter of John of Gaunt, who was the first Duke of Lancaster. Arthur, the tutor, the male of them, was the great-great-grandson of John Beaufort, who was an illegitimate son of John of Gaunt, that same John of Gaunt, but by a different woman. So Catherine of Aragon was the third cousin of her father-in-law, King Henry VII of England, and the fourth cousin to Elizabeth of York, who was her mother-in-law. So that's part of the feudalism problem. First, abusing the sacrament of marriage for political reasons like this. And then second, this idea they had the blood, that the aristocratic blood and royal blood was pure, so they only wanted to marry people from their own class. Anyway, the young couple, after the 2 weeks of celebration, they moved to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border. They both very quickly became violently ill with what was then called the sweating sickness. Now, who knows what that was, but whatever it was something to provoke fever, and it did have a pretty high mortality rate. Catherine survived. Arthur did not. Arthur died on April 2nd, 1502, less than 5 months after their marriage. 5 months after their marriage. Catherine later swore that the marriage had never been consummated. Now, 5 months seems like a long time, for a teenage couple to not consummate the marriage. But she said, they got sick, and they were both sick for a long time. She eventually recovered, but he never did. So anyway, that's what she swore. The significance of that is going to be revealed shortly. On the 10th of May, 1502, Ferdinand and Isabel instructed the Spanish ambassador to England to negotiate to continue the alliance by marrying the now widowed Catherine to her late husband's younger brother, Prince Henry, who now became the Prince of Wales and heir apparent, who would become King Henry VIII. September 1502, a treaty was drafted between England and Spain, which provided for this, that the treaty would continue and it would be solemnized by the marriage of Catherine to Henry. There's a problem. In canon law, that this would be affinity. She would contract second-degree affinity and therefore be ineligible to marry her late husband's younger brother. So they needed dispensation from the Pope. In August of 1503, her parents, Ferdinand and Isabel, requested such a dispensation from Pope Alexander VI. Pope Alexander died before granting it, so it was granted by a future pope in October of 1504, enabling that marriage to take place. The failure of that marriage, the breakdown of that marriage, is what made England Protestant, as we'll see. If it had been consummated, if the marriage had been consummated, then she would have would have in violation of Leviticus, book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 21. Quote, "If a man takes his brother's wife, it is a severe defilement, and he has disgraced his brother. They shall be childless." (1502). Columbus went on his fourth and what turned out to be his last voyage, in which he discovered at least the coast of Honduras and Panama. Following year, 1503, King James IV of Scotland married Margaret Tudor, who was the daughter of King Henry VII of England, therefore a sister of Prince, at this time, Prince Henry, who would become King Henry VIII. James of Scotland was of the Stuart dynasty, which ruled Scotland from 1371 until 1714, and would rule England simultaneously within that time period from 1603 to 1649, and then again from 1660 to 1714. They were, the name Stuart is because their ancestry, they were, at one point, the family provided the royal stewards of Scotland. The daughter of the sixth steward married Robert the Bruce, who was the liberator of Scotland. Their son, Robert II, became the first Stuart king of England. They adopted the French spelling of their name in order to distinguish themselves from the office of steward. So the family, the House of Stuart, is Stuart. This Tudor-Stuart marriage would enable Mary Queen of Scots to later lay claim to the English throne until Queen Elizabeth I, a daughter of Henry VIII, had her beheaded. This marriage alliance further enabled James VI of Scotland to follow Elizabeth I as monarch of England when Elizabeth I died childless in 1603. This guy, James VI of Scotland, James I of England, escalated the Protestant movement in the British Isles when he forcibly resettled Scottish Presbyterians into Catholic Northern Ireland to serve him as a military ruling class over the Irish Catholics. The 10 counties of Northern Ireland today are still Protestant, based on these descendants, and it's still occupied territory. At least, those who have Irish ancestry consider it such. On the 6th of August, 1503, Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare were invited to dinner in the home of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. At dinner, they became desperately ill. Must have been something they ate, or maybe something they drank. Cesare, being a younger man, recovered, but Pope Alexander VI died on August 18th, 1503. Very shortly after he died, his corpse became swollen, the skin turned black, became a putrid black color, like a brownish pus started oozing out of his mouth, his nose, and his eyes. So everyone assumed he was poisoned. But officially, the cause of death was malaria. He was followed as the 215th Pope by Pius III. Okay, we've been going for a while there, so we will pause here. No, actually, one more thing.